In the next two videos, we're going to be looking at the GH5's autofocus. So we're going to look at how to operate it on the camera. And in part two, we'll be looking at the two most common scenarios that I think it could be used. And I'll be doing some tests to see whether it is actually usable and how best to use it. In case you're wondering why this looks slightly different to the other videos that you've watched, I might look a little bit older and hopefully wiser. That's because I'm shooting this in 2020. Panasonic keep doing firmware updates to the camera and the autofocus has changed slightly. So I'm trying to keep the course up to date and hopefully this is the latest and it might be the last update that they do that will affect autofocus. In case you already know what the autofocus modes are and you just want to skip straight to the results about which perform better, then you can skip this video and just go to part two if I am just a tester monkey to you. So let's address the elephant in the room, and that is that the GH5's autofocus comes under fire and is poo-pooed on by almost every other manufacturer. The focus sometimes doesn't acquire focus on your subject properly at all, or sometimes it can lose focus inexplicably, and also the camera exhibits a pulsing, which you might be able to see in the conveniently placed lights behind me. It's where the focus is acquired, but it will just shift in and out, almost as if it's checking focus, and it will move the focus plane quickly backwards and forwards. And for me, that can ruin a shot, so I wouldn't necessarily use autofocus in any commercial or professional setting, but I do concede it has its uses for things like this. And while I don't use the continuous autofocus on the GH5, I do use the autofocus button on the back, even in manual focus mode, just to acquire focus before I go and shoot. Even that sometimes isn't 100%, but I do use that. Let's also remember that no camera is perfect at autofocus yet. The Canons have a really good reputation, but even those can sometimes struggle. I hired one of the expensive cinema cameras, the C200, recently, but I found even that was struggling to detect what a face was. So none of them are 100% perfect forever. GH5 probably isn't among the best, but if you can live with the issues, then you might find it usable depending on the kind of project that you're doing.
So how do you set the camera up to use autofocus for video? Well, there are three steps. First of all, you need to turn the dial to one of the AF modes. Then you've got to ensure that continuous autofocus is on in the menu itself. This is where you also decide whether you want to autofocus continuously or just while you're actually recording. Then if your lens has an autofocus switch, make sure that that's also set to autofocus on. Now, if you're coming from the world of photography, you'll be aware of the AFS, AFF and AFC modes, but it's worth noting that for video, they'll do the same thing. When continuous autofocus is on in the menus, the camera will try to maintain focus throughout the clip. We then have to decide which autofocus mode we want to use, and that can be done by using this button on the back of the camera. Hitting that button will give you the 5 options that we've got for video. First, we've got face detect, which should focus on the face that it sees in the frame, and when the camera doesn't detect a face, it then reverts to the 225 area mode. Tracking, in theory, lets you pick a subject by tapping the screen, and you lock on to that subject by half pressing the shutter down. You can't specify the size of the tracking area, so you're completely reliant on the camera guessing the right size of the subject in this case, and that is a bit hit and miss. 225 area lets you choose from 225 autofocus areas. You customize where those should be by pressing down on the menu button, and then you can move that area around just by moving the joystick or clicking the wheel in whichever direction you want. Or if you're not as OCD as I am, you can get your greasy paws all over the screen and do it on there directly. Scrolling the wheel here will actually change the size of this area. Custom Multi, in theory, lets you change the shape of the 225 area if you want to focus on a fixed object of a particular shape. Obviously, that's not going to be any good if your subject is moving or if you're moving. One area lets you specify a box and the camera will try to detect a subject within that area to focus on. This can be moved or resized just like with the 225 area. So if those are all new to you, that might have been a bit dauntingly fast, but we'll come on to which of those modes that I prefer later on, and if I were to ever use autofocus, then I would only use one of two options. When it comes to video recording, we've then got some other settings to consider, as we can tell the camera how fast we want it to rack focus and also how sensitive it should be, i.e. how long after the subject has moved significantly the camera decides to trigger the focus change. So obviously on high autofocus speed, when it has decided that it needs to change focus, it will make that change quickly, and on high sensitivity, when it detects the subject has moved significantly, it will react as fast as possible by triggering that focus change. When this setting is set to off, it seems to behave as if it's set to 0, 0, so bang in the middle of both of those modes. In the most recent firmware update, they also introduced a near shift and far shift option. This is designed to help the camera determine what should be in focus. So for example, if you have a nearby object and a far away object, you could select near shift so that it prioritizes focus on the near point. And similarly, if you wanted to focus on the far away object and you didn't want to get distracted by the nearby object, far shift should in theory allow you to do that. Now don't get too excited about those near shift and far shift modes, because I suspect they were made for the photography side and they don't work in continuous focus. We'll look at the testing for that in part 2. So that was a run through of how to set up the camera and lens for autofocus. In the next video, we'll do some testing of those modes and we'll come to some conclusions about how best to use them.